Hello and welcome to the Tonearm, where we connect you with the people and ideas moving culture forward. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today we're putting the Tonearm's needle on Zeena Parkins, composer, improviser, and one of the most singular forces in experimental music. Zeena has spent 4 decades dismantling what the harp can do through electronics, object preparations, and a series of custom electric instruments she built herself. And she's turned a concert hall fixture into something alive and unpredictable. Her collaborators range from Björk to John Zorn to Pauline Oliveros. Last year, she released 2 records paying tribute to her years teaching at Mills College before its closure, Modesty of the Magic Thing and Lament of the Maker. And she's performing this spring at Big Ears Festival in Knoxville. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow and a 3-time Bessie Award winner for her work composing for dance. We cover all of it, her instruments, her process, and what it means to make music at the edge of what's possible. While you're listening to our talk, visit us at thetonearm.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter or help us to do more of what we do by becoming a paid supporter. And now, Zeena Parkins. I wanted to start by talking to you a little bit about Mills College.
Yeah.
The situation with Mills has hit home for me in a slightly varied way. Within the last 2 weeks, I think it's been 2 weeks today, my oldest son attends California College for the Arts.
Oh, and they just announced that they're closing. I saw that. You can be sure that I saw that.
Yeah, I assumed you did.
Yeah.
There's so much to say in there in terms of both these historic Bay Area institutions, just the role of those institutions for 20th century and post-war creative fields.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, the personal nature of that loss for you as an artist and an educator?
Well, first, I also want to say that it wasn't just the 20th century. It definitely moved into the first 20 years of the 21st century. I was always really impressed at the stamp that all of the arts institutions in the Bay Area gave to the Bay Area. So that includes the San Francisco Art Institute, the CCA, and Mills, that they were a constant feeding into the cultural life and vitality of what was going on in the Bay Area. And it was a vitality. And of course, that changed with various generations, but I felt it still in the time that I was at Mills, which was the last 13 years, which was all in the 21st century. So I never really experienced Mills before that.
Yeah, I struggle to think about 2026. I can't believe we're in the 21st century. I should get used to it by now.
Yes, I know. It's profound, I think. I really did not have a very limited experience with the West Coast before I started teaching at Mills. I had a very significant experience in the very early 90s because a friend of mine, artist Nayland Blake, was curating a gallery in San Francisco and invited me to do a concert there. It was my first solo concert, and it was on electric harp. I did the show. It was a full house. I remember they had raked seating, and it was quite extraordinary for me because it was a first. And at the end of the show, it was quite well received. And at the end of the show, this very tall gentleman came down and said, "I'm starting a record label, and I want you to be my first release on the label." And of course, I didn't believe him because, who would believe that? But in the end, this person turned out to be a silent partner for the label Table of the Elements.
Wow.
And they did release my first solo record, and of course went on to be a very important label, American Experimental Music. So
that's quite a variation on the cigar chomping record executive.
It is.
Kid, I want to put you on my label.
Exactly. So that, besides that, and a couple of other random gigs here and there up and down the coast. I didn't really have an experience, and I didn't really understand what the Pacific Rim actually meant, and the kind of power of all the coasts, what significance what that even meant, actually. So when I started teaching at Mills, and I got the job initially because I first went replacing Frith, who had been teaching there for a sabbatical semester. And that went so well. When he was offered to start an improvisation program in the music school in Basel, which he really wanted to do, he suggested that we then share his position, which is how I got myself there in the first place. And I had taught at other schools. Actually, I had taught for 2 years at the Museum for Fine Arts in Boston, the school there. So School for the Museum of Fine Arts, SMFA, in Boston. So I had experience teaching, and so it wasn't a new experience, but I really cut my teeth on what it means to be an educator when I was teaching at Mills, because it was a long-term project, you could say. And that school was such a special place in terms of like a kind of hotbed of experimental music.
Yeah.
And the people that went through there, the people that were there, the students that wanted to come to Mills, often you would see the transformation of students becoming artists within the short 2 years that they were there. And it was extremely inspiring. Besides, it's an absolutely beautiful campus. It's in the middle of Oakland, but they have 135 acres that were just a stunning place to call where you go to work. The other thing is that they had 2 beautiful acoustic pedal harps there. So when I started teaching there, I just dragged one of those harps into my office, and it stayed there for 13 years. In other words, I didn't have to give up what I did because I didn't have an instrument when I was there. It was like kind of waiting for me to be there. With the way it ended and the ending of it, it's heartbreaking, really. And I describe that in that solo record that I just released, Lament for the Maker, this kind of heartbreaking feeling of an ending of some endings are hard.
Yeah, and I appreciate that context because it speaks to the fact that this was so much more than just a teaching gig. Like this idea that the harp was there waiting for you, and the lineage of post-war and into the, as you said, 21st century figures that came through there as students and teachers. I'm curious about the inclusiveness of that record in terms of the commissioning of the other Mills community members and colleagues into the work. It adds a certain gravitas to the project and import to the project.
The thing is that I would add to what you just said is that it's not just the history of Mills, which was very important. It was what it was in the present while I was there, which, it was always changing as things do. When I first arrived, Roscoe Mitchell was there, which was extraordinary. Fred was there. And then my other colleagues, William Wynett, the extraordinary percussionist that became a kind of very important collaborator for my work. James Fay, Chris Brown, John Bischoff, Letitia Sonomi. I mean, these are all incredibly formidable musical minds. And I had already done a project with Letitia, but I wanted to, before I left, I thought I wanted to get into the minds of some of my colleagues that I hadn't really had a chance to do. That's, I would say, one of the primary reasons in this last-ditch effort to connect musically with these important musical thinkers. So that's why I asked James Fay and John Bischoff write these pieces for me, as well as Letitia, which was sort of a continuation of a duo project that we had just done. And Fred, of course, I've worked with continuously since I was quite young. So I already had a working relationship with him. And Chris Brown had invited me and Nate to do a project with him. So I'd already had some experience working with him. So it's really the ones I picked that I hadn't had. I wanted to continue something I started with Letitia, and I really wanted, how do they think about putting something together? What are they going to do with an acoustic harp?
Yeah.
And so that was the kind of impetus to ask.
I appreciate your sort of insistent but gentle reminder that we're not talking about history in the past, that there was this vital current And I think that's just the fact that I keep slipping into that, I think is very representative of a lot of the problems in the modern creative scene is that, and it's a spectrum, right? There's a fetishization of what's happened in the past. There's a rightful glorification of it, but we don't always appreciate what we have in the moment and the scenes that are percolating now and the work that's being done now. And that's reflected in everything from, symphonies and not having new music program. I don't need to belabor it with you, but it is an important fact that you keep bringing back to, is that we're not talking about history.
Yeah, and I will say that until our very last class, when we were informed that we will not be taking any more music students in, no more graduate students, no more undergrad music students will be admitted into what became Mills at Northeastern, and now it's just simply Northeastern. But that even the very last class was extraordinary, that it was important for me to be there and share my experiences with this last class. It wasn't a throwaway.
Quite honestly, that's what my son's worried about. He's a senior next year, so he'll be the last graduating class, but he was very concerned that won't every professor and won't every facilities won't everybody employed at the school be on LinkedIn updating their resumes? Who's going to be there to finish the work? And he said, I can understand that that's a genuine concern, and they haven't gotten a lot of information from the school yet. So.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Believe me, you don't get information. You often get put on a kind of trail that's not leading to where the situation is going. Like, for instance, we were all asked, after we knew the merger was going to happen, each of the professors were asked to come up with 3 new classes that could possibly be classes that would merge the interests of Northeastern University with our interests. And I doubt that any of those classes were ever even, those descriptions were ever even looked at.
It's like a way to channel your energy so you don't make trouble.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. As you might imagine, I speak with a lot of creative music artists and composers and improvised music performers who do teach. Something I have found really delightful in talking to people is the different experiences they have of being the teacher and how it interacts with, perhaps informs their own practice. I expected many more people to sort of say, well, it's a gig. I can't make money as a creative music professional, so I got to teach. And that doesn't seem to be what I hear from people. There's a real, especially when you start to get into the jazz realm, this idea of that lineage of, jazz being an oral tradition. But I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about what you get from being a teacher, spiritually, artistically. What does it nourish for you?
That's an interesting point, because I would say when I first started teaching, it was a gig.
Sure.
When I was offered a full-time teaching position, which who in their right mind would turn down, I turned it down. That was for the job at the School Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I was just not ready to be a teacher. And I knew it. And of course, 4 months later, I got an email from Björk asking me if I'd be interested in playing harp in some of her songs. And that led to a 3 or 4 year collaboration and record making and touring. So I definitely made the right decision. But when Fred asked me, I was interested in teaching again. So it sort of came around to having an interest in understanding what that was again, because I'd already done it. But the funny thing is, I was teaching mostly in the graduate program at Mills and just a couple of classes here and there in the undergraduate. And the thing is, I never went to graduate school. I had a very bad relationship with higher education. Mm. I'd never really been interested in it. I was fortunate enough to enter New York in the mid-'80s with an undergraduate degree from Bard, it was a fine arts degree. It wasn't great school, but they didn't even have the it was so different then. But, I came out with a BFA, and when I entered the scene at that point, I immediately was working with Pauline Oliveros, John Zorn, Harp, Frith, Butch Morris. Why would I go to graduate school?
That is graduate school.
That is graduate school. And I took every advantage of, at that moment, having a skill set that all these various people, these incredible artists, they could use me. That was really extraordinary. And I didn't really know anything. You know, I was a very hard worker, but I definitely learned as I went along. But so I never had the never had the graduate school experience. So when I started teaching in graduate school, I didn't really, you know, I hit in a lot of ways those first years, many apologies to my early students at Mills, you know, I didn't really know what I was doing. And I remember the first few years, I would just give lectures. I would talk nonstop. You know, I would study during the week, give these lectures, not let anyone speak because I was terrified as to, you know, how it would respond, that I would get slipped up by someone that knew more than I did. And eventually I figured it out. And then something switched or clicked, or you could say I put the hours in and did the study. It really was like a light went on or switch happened, and I was able to share, have exchanges that became so meaningful and important. And, you know, I don't have kids, so one really delightful thing is being able to have this kind of relationship with people of a different generation. Mm. I'm a tia. I have nieces and nephews, but I don't have my own children. So one thing, and not that these were my children, but I was able to have, I would say, meaningful exchanges and relationships and working things out with people that probably a generation that might not have the same interaction and kind of interactions with. So that was very, very important to me. And then I just, you know, I'm a nerd, so that saved me probably, you know, that allowed for this transformation to happen because I was all in. Once. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but.
Well, they're under no obligation to exactly answer my questions. That's okay. I love the idea of the elder role in our culture, how, you know, it's not necessary, and I don't mean age, I mean the imparting of experience and the guidance and the mentorship. It's always beautiful when young people have access to that, but it's always beautiful to witness it being done. And that's sort of what I hear you saying, is that you get to play a different cultural role, and a one that we don't talk about a lot, but it's important to have like those non-familial elders in your life as a young person.
And I would say once I kind of found the vitality of what it is to be an educator, that is what enabled me to be a better educator, what the components were to that vitality.
I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about Bard and about New York, but before I go there, you said something earlier that I didn't want to leave unexplored. Could you talk a little bit about the Pacific Rim and what you learned and what that meant?
Oh, yeah. Ultimately, that has taken shape now. I mean, Gamelan is one huge thing. And it's not that these things aren't explored on the East Coast, but I certainly didn't understand them in the way that I understood them when I started understanding who the musicians, the composers, the players were, and how they were influenced by, let's say, Gamelan, or about different kinds of tuning systems, and how that sort of fed this connection to other cultures, felt so present with this connection of the Pacific Rim, as I noticed it. So someone like Terry Riley, Lou Harrison, and like James Tenney, these weren't necessarily composers that were at the tip of my tongue, or what their interests were not necessarily on the tip of my tongue when I was more, lived in New York and was always going to Europe, sometimes skip over to Japan, but, it was always headed to a different place. And then I would say that all of this kind of understanding of what that was, more like sort of like, I don't know, it melted into me, you could say. And that expression was realized also, you could say, in my focus, these one-off Lou Harrison instruments that Willie Wynant had in his studio, and my interest in the work of the artist DeFeo, who is an extraordinary Bay Area artist who actually taught at Mills for the last 10 years of her life. So all these things kind of begin to like fall in a huge pile of coincidence in front of me. And this kind of gained momentum with this idea of making a piece that merged the tuning systems and instruments that Lou Harrison had one-off been making that were bequeathed to Willie Wynant, that I would find, willy-nilly, so to speak, in his studios, like collecting dust, not doing anything. I would pull it out and say, whoa, what's this? And then also at the same time, there was an important retrospective show of DeFeo's work in 2012 at SF MoMA that I saw. I mean, there's one at the Whitney and one is at SF MoMA. It was in that period of time that totally blew me away. She's famous for the huge painting called The Rose. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a floor to ceiling of like paint on paint on paint, like a ton of paint, literally on this massive, she calls painting, but it's almost like, I call it an opera. But she spent 8 years working on it. And then at the end of that process, she ended up making a lot of different kinds of work. And I connected with the foundation, the DeFeo Foundation, and Leah Levy, who's the director of that, which is in Berkeley. And so these two things, these instruments that I started finding in Willie Wynant's studio, and this interest in the work of DeFeo and how interesting it was that she also had been connected to Mills for 10 years. So it all kind of fell in place. And that really became a kind of second homage to my life in the West Coast, besides the Lament of the Maker, which actually commissioned new works for harp, was this other piece called Modesty of the Magic Thing, which sort of merged some specific work of DeFeo called Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and this one particular instrument of Lou Harrison's, which I had remade and made this piece that was eventually released on Zodic. And it's a piece for metal, percussion, and acoustic harp. And since then, I'm now working on a kind of companion piece with another instrument of Lou Harrison's that I had made, and some other aspects of DeFeo's work. So they'll kind of work in tandem. So like, everything that kind of over the years seeped in about what it might mean that we have connections to other parts of the world from this ocean, that seeped in for me. That's how it seeped in.
That's, again, very helpful context. It sets up what I wanted to ask you earlier, which was this idea of all these different inputs, if you will, or, you seem very sensitive to different artistic inputs and different creative people and their work and integrating it into your practice. I'm curious if you could take me back a little bit as a young adult or a person approaching going to Bard, what were your inputs then? And like, how did you, can you take me through that period of going to Bard and landing in New York and in that sort of downtown culture or that creative culture that you articulated? What were you into? What were you doing? What led you into that world?
First of all, I grew up in Detroit, and I didn't go to Bard right away. I went to University of Michigan as a piano major. Before I was a piano major, I actually went to a very important high school called Cass Technical High School, which was a public high school in downtown Detroit. And you had to audition to get in. They had they had several extraordinary departments, including an amazing music department. And they assigned orchestral instruments to all the pianists because they felt so sorry for the pianists alone in their practice room. So I was assigned an instrument. I had nothing to do with it. But I go the first day of school to this room, 101 Annex, and open the door, and there are 8 concert grand harps in there. And a woman named Velma Froud, who was a very old-fashioned but very extraordinary pedagogue of classical harp training. So I decided to take this more kind of old-fashioned training. I'll do it because I really fell in love with harp. I was also dancing a lot as well and studying piano. And I was even a workaholic in those days, in my early days. I was very shy. So I think I just sort of put all that, whatever that energy eventually came into just practicing and studying dance, and just sort of went into that world. But when I graduated, I learned to play harp. And when I graduated, I didn't have a harp because I just used the one at school. So I became a piano major again. And that's what I auditioned for when I went to University of Michigan in the School of Music. And I found it's very different now. But in those days, it was very much a kind of Juilliard wannabe kind of music department. It was really like the world was closing in. It wasn't expanding. And after 2 years, I just can't do this anymore. This is not the direction I want to be going in. And then I ended up at Bard. And Bard was great in terms of just sort of letting me do what I wanted to do. And also the incredible film department was super, super influential. Like understanding what experimental film was a kind of major new like batch of information or batch of input that I had no idea about before.
So you needed freedom from that sort of classical conservatory rigidity? Is it?
No, it wasn't what I didn't want to be. Really, I didn't want to be a classical pianist. I was okay as a pianist. I was never going to be a concert pianist. No, I might have, if I had ended up in the classical world, maybe I would have done chamber music or focused on contemporary music. But I was never, I wasn't really.
When you first met the harp that day in the room full of harps, did you have any preconceived notion or stereotype about the harp?
Who would even think about a harp?
Yeah.
It's the most impractical thing you could ever in your life think of having any kind of relationship with. I had no idea. All I know is that when I first sat behind a harp, I didn't know that it had pedals. I didn't know how complex the relationship between, it's sort of like the choreography of doing the pedals compared to at the same time what you're doing with your hands. So the fact that I trained already as a dancer, like that kind of physical relationship with instrument really was attractive to me. I could get that. So yeah, there was no question I was going to study the harp with Velma Froud. Let's put it that way. And that meant coming early to tune, staying afterward. She demanded, it was like a full-on commitment in the summers, after school, before school. Yeah, you had to, because how else are you going to learn to play a new instrument? You had to have that devotion from the beginning.
Especially at that age, right? Like that's a relatively late age to be do harpists generally start as young as some of the other instruments?
I think so. I think a lot of harpists that had a parent that was a harpist start early. Yeah.
I think, I asked you about stereotypes because I think it's easy to think of the harp as like something delicate. I think you're known for a real physicality with the instrument and a relationship that is much more present.
Much killer. Yeah.
And, hearing you talk about being a dancer, but also as a pianist, right? Like the multi-limbed aspect of being a pianist as well. It seems like you were primed to be able to embrace the harp.
Yeah, I was. And I really, had I continued with piano, I definitely was more attracted to doing contemporary music. So maybe things that had been more percussive, or I was very open to different kind of sound palettes. And so I think, of course, I had no idea. I mean, a real revelation was which wasn't until after I graduated from high school, but hearing the Cage prepared piano pieces, or hearing Fred or Keith Rowe preparing guitar, like those were real revelations in terms of what's possible with strings, or what's possible with a body, a wooden sound body. All of a sudden that sort of opened up a huge huge place for me to explore that was very inspiring.
Yeah. And then there's the electric harp, which you've pioneered and spent a lot of time developing. If when I was preparing for our time together, a theme that I kept returning to in my notes was this idea of relationship, the relationships you have with the instrument, the relationship you have with collaborators, or even the works of other people, how you revisit them as inspiration and material. And your relationship with the electric harp is fascinating to me because the instrument itself, like there's nothing static about it. It seems to be this very living, breathing, ongoing, I don't know if dialogue's the right word, refinement. What's happening there with you and that electric instrument?
Okay, so you have to understand, when I moved to New York, I didn't move to New York right away after Bard. I really shied away a little bit. I wasn't quite sure. I stayed at Bard an extra year and worked in the music department and had some odd jobs, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to interface with New York right when I left Bard, because I didn't have a harp. So long story short, I ended up becoming part of this troupe. It was a kind of theater troupe that presented their theatrics in the guise of a circus. It was called the Janus Circus. And that it was started as a school project with a friend of mine. And
sounds very Bard.
Yeah, it was very Bard. And this troupe ended up going to Europe for 6 months to essentially, do this theater performances for elementary schools in the Netherlands. So we had a gig, and I was there for 6 months. And my participation in this was costume designer. I was a dancing bear that jumped through a heart of fire and played accordion. I started playing accordion, which was fantastic because I was like, wow, I have a little keyboard instrument I can just sling across my shoulder. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
So, but there was a circus band, and I wasn't part of the band. I was really performing. And in this band was the drummer, Chris Cutler. So we became friends. And at some point in Ljubljana, on a walk, he was like, I'm looking for a harpist to do a project. And of course, he had no idea that I had played harp.
Wow.
And it was just, it's like these things that happen that are unexplainable. But that was a bit of a turning point because I was like, I'm a harpist and, I would love to do it. And again, just like the guy that came down in San Francisco that said they wanted to make me to be the first release, of course, I didn't really believe Chris that he really was going to hire me to play harp in a project of his with Dagmar Krause and Robert Y. and Phil Minton, like all these incredible people. But sure enough, it did happen. That was news from Babel. And we ended up making 2 records. But as soon as this tour in Europe was over, this was all I needed to go back to playing harp. So I ended up moving back to Detroit, getting a job, finding a teacher, Marilyn Bartlett, who was this extraordinary harpist who was harpist for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Studied 2 lessons a week with her. I was just all in. And I was home for, 8 or 9 months, just playing all the time to try to get back. And she hooked me up to buy a small harp for when I came back to New York. And I ended up working in a company that published harp music called Lear International. And they had also sold harps, the Venus harp. And I was able to work during the day. Then they would let me practice in the evening in their showroom. So, it's sort of like,
wow,
everything was lining up, you could say. So eventually I got a pedal harp and, started working with everybody that we know I worked with. And one of the situations, and I was very interested in taking and using the harp as an improviser. And I was a beginning improviser, but so I'd bring my harps to all these various little tiny clubs in the East Village. And what I noticed was that, the harp is a quiet instrument, and I'd often be playing with electric guitar players or trombone players or drummers, and you really couldn't hear the instrument. It wasn't designed to be heard against those kind of that volume or that dynamic. So I tried a bunch of different ways to make the harp louder, various kinds of whatever was available in terms of amplifying the instrument with little pickups and stuff. And it was all basically lame. It was not a beautiful sound anymore. It was became very tinny, like none of the solutions were working. So finally I was like, And especially when I got into Skeleton Crew with Tom Core and Fred Frith, they really wanted me to play harp, but it was clear we're not going to tour with an acoustic harp. So it was with Tom that I figured out that I needed to have an electric instrument. And again, in the mid to late 80s, you couldn't go buy an electric harp. There was no place to get an electric instrument. And believe me, if there was, I would have figured out how to get an electric instrument, but there wasn't. So Tom, kind of with a friend, kind of banged out a prototype, and I started playing that, and it was clear, as primitive as that instrument was, this was an idea that could work. And then we had Ken Parker, who recently passed away, actually, who was a guitar maker and ended up making pickups and everything. We came to him with the idea of making a real instrument, and he was totally into it. And in 20 hours, he made me my first real harp, electric harp. Just went there in his house in Connecticut. We stayed for 20 hours. He would ask me questions, and I said, I want a whammy bar on it. God only knows why.
Wow.
And it was the right decision, obviously. And he figured out how to put a whammy bar on it. And, that first one, and then it went through a number of changes, and it became my project. It was like, how do we make this a better instrument? What do I do with this thing? How do I play? But that was the beginning. And it was made of necessity. It wasn't like, it was really, I needed not to be the softest person in the room. Let's put it that way.
The Tonearm will be right back after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonearm.com, our online journal covering unexpected music and culture. Right now on the Tonearm, you'll find new profiles of Brian Eno collaborator and storyteller Betta A, expressive Swedish solo artist Fagel, author Audrey Golden on seminal punk band The Raincoats, intuitive ambient composer Aukai, and so much more. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter, Talk of the Tonearm. That's thetonearm.com. The Tonearm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to the Tonearm. Pardon my ignorance with this question, but were there really no electric harps at that point, or were they just like custom made for individuals? Was there no sense of an electric harp at that point?
I'm sure I wasn't the first, but no.
Seems so late for there to not have been one.
I think it was on the precipice of it being a thing, but it wasn't quite there yet. Now you can get beautiful. We can't see it, but the Kamek was one of the first companies to make a beautiful electroacoustic harp and electric harp, and with real attention to having the quality be high quality. That's the harp. They endorsed me using the harp for all the Björk tours that I ever did. And eventually they gifted me a harp, which was like amazing. But no, I can't say definitively, but we looked around and we couldn't find one.
Other than the issue of sort of the volume and the standing out in a non-classical context when you're on stage with electric performers or louder music, how do you view the limitations of the harp, and how do those limitations actually serve as catalysts for you? I think, most artists I speak with, regardless of their medium, are entranced by the idea of limitation, right? Like give me a box and I will work my way out of it, or decorate the box. I'm curious, what are the limitations of the harp that are actually exciting?
The harp, the acoustic harp and the electric harp, my particular electric harp, are very different beasts. That's for one thing. So The acoustic harp, I have been entranced by what I will call certain impossibilities of the instrument, like to play chromatically because of the way the harp is designed, or to sustain a tone, which, you pluck it, and then unless you use a bow of some kind, or to do any kind of smooth shifting from one pitch to another in a kind of gliding kind of way. So all these kinds of ways of playing are not naturally available with an acoustic instrument. And I've been very intrigued by those limitations, as people are, and again, yes, I was really interested in digging into the limitations and finding out what it would mean to try to do something that isn't easy to do, or perhaps even impossible to do. And what did that generate? So that's the acoustic harp. The electric harp is a whole different thing because that harp doesn't have real flexible tuning. You tune it in. There are no pedals. There are no pedals to make changes like there are on acoustic harp. There are no levers. It's not like a lever harp where you can sharpen by half step. So it is what it is. You tune in the pitches and that's your fixed tuning for a show. So then you can you focus on other things, if that's the case. Focus on textures, on rhythms, on, on whatever peculiar tuning you want to put into it. That's going to be your tuning for either a piece or a set of music. So it becomes more like maybe like modular synthesis almost, like you put together different kinds of pedals that are going to change the sound and you see how those pedals interact and how that will affect the instrument. So it becomes a completely different experience as a player. And also, again, like what I said at the beginning, I had this instrument made and then I had to figure out what it could do. And it's interesting, like one of the huge upgrades to the electric harp that happened was when a friend of mine who is a sound artist and not an instrument builder by trade, but happens to be know materials and is an excellent instrument maker. And eventually he did make one of the versions of the electric harp. His name is Doug Henderson. He was like, oh, if you put ebony wood on this part of the harp, it's a very, very hard wood. And that's going to completely change what's possible on this one part of the harp. So, for instance, just understanding what a change in material is going to do, not only its moisture content, all that stuff that instrument builders think about, and like what the ergonomics, how we had to alter the shape of it to make sure I could get my hands in there and do stuff. All the, how we can make it as light as possible. So I'm not like carrying this 10-pound instrument, like running up and down hallways in the Frankfurt airport, but how profoundly even a change in the kind of wood that you're using is going to make it a whole new playing experience and open up all these possibilities.
It seems endlessly fascinating.
Well, I'm enjoying it. I just think it's like a magic instrument, this instrument that got made.
Mm.
Every time I think I've reached a limit is an interesting moment for seeing what happens on the other side of that limit.
And the gratification of building such a modern and expansive repertoire for these instruments.
Yeah, I mean, I think of repertoire much more with my acoustic harp, especially these days. And I think of the electric harp. I make pieces, but I think of it really as an instrument for an improviser.
That's a great distinction.
It's a very different outcome. I don't want to think about the repertoire of the electric harp because there's only one. So who's going to play it? But I can think about that. And it's something I haven't thought about until recently. Funny that you should bring it up, about the pieces that I'm making that could possibly be played by other people besides myself at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Speaking of that, I'm also very intrigued by your compositional work for dance. The idea of, I need to just spit it out. How does composing for movement, what does it require in a composer that's different? Like, what are you thinking about? How do the dancers fit into the compositional process? Are they instruments? Are they?
Oh, no. I mean,
it's befuddling to me.
I again, was really, really fortunate when I came to New York. One of the first pieces I did with Zorn, John Zorn, was a game piece called Dark. And it was a piece for dancers and musicians. And we did it at the Sculpture Center at MoMA.
Not so bad at all.
It's one of my early gigs. And that's when I began to understand, there's a really interesting scene of experimental movers. Of course, because I had danced, and I'd also danced at Bard, by the way. I knew I wasn't going to be a professional dancer, but I was really attracted to moving and especially watching people. I love watching bodies move. So I ended up falling in with a group of people that were improvising, and we ended up starting this thing at PS 122, which doesn't exist anymore, but called Music Dance, which was a Saturday morning get-together, kind of informal get-together, where dancers and musicians would get together and improvise, but talk about, like, how are we communicating with each other? And it was not towards a performance, but it was just kind of a workshop. And we did that for several years. So that was sort of my entree into understanding who this community was. And I ended up working quite closely with several choreographers, and one important choreographer was Jennifer Munson. And when we started working together, we were both improvisers. And eventually she became a choreographer and I became a composer. And remember, I hadn't really composed before I moved to New York. So I had no clue. I'd started improvising seriously when I came to New York. So all of this was really new. I was quite primed and ready to go and ready for the challenge, but I didn't have experience with all this when I first came to New York. For me, my training to become a composer came with this work with choreographers. First as an improviser, and then eventually setting material. And just, there are topics for various pieces, and you work together to find the best solutions for those topics. And it wouldn't not have happened in some random way with any dancers or any choreographers. It's because of these particular people that I work with: Jennifer Lacey, Jennifer Munson, Neil Greenberg, Didi Dorvillier. These were hugely important in helping me understand my own musical language and supporting that. So it was really in this dance world that I was able to understand how to be a composer. And eventually my interest in watching dancers move and responding to that compositionally eventually emerged an interest in sound moving. So I also became interested in multi-speaker diffusion in the context of making compositions for dance. So that also became a really important aspect of my work, and a particularly important aspect of my scores for dance.
What's the collaborative process like with a choreographer? Is it like a film where you watch the dance silently and then create a score?
No, because we're making it together from scratch.
That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I'm not adding music to something that's already been made. In film, you do that more.
Yeah,
you get it when the final edit is done, but not in the way that I worked with dance. We would go on residencies and really make it together and try things. Some things work, some things didn't work, have an idea about what the orchestration would be and what the goals were, and then try to figure it out together. For me, it wouldn't have worked to make music for something already made in dance. It wouldn't have worked. I can tell you that right now.
Because
I probably wouldn't know what to do.
I
had to be in from the beginning of understanding what it was that I was making sound for, and have the time to experiment and have discussions and see what worked and what didn't work. And then the luxury of working with dance is then you get multiple performances. You don't have to make it perfect for this one performance, and that's it. So you get multiple, and you be able to, like, by hearing something performed numerous times and seeing how it works, you understand something about the piece that you can't possibly understand from a rehearsal, and you can't possibly understand from just a single performance. So that part of the process of making was hugely important.
That's fascinating. Is there at the risk of asking an overly general question about this, how many performances does it usually take where you're like, okay, it's locked now?
Usually you get 3 or 4 performances. So you get to see it, but then it goes on tour, can go on tour. You get to see it. At that point, it's probably we know what it is by that point.
Yeah.
And then you have your good days and your bad days, oh, that was a good version of that. Oh, that wasn't quite on.
At the start of our call, you referred to yourself as shy. Is that something in the past? Because I don't see it.
No, I was incredibly shy. I think that coupled well with being a workaholic. I think I see those things working together now from this point of view. Yeah, I guess I'm not so shy now.
Yeah, let's not play armchair psychologist. A couple other quick things. I know our time together is coming to its close. This episode is going to air probably in the weeks right before Big Ears.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm really curious. I'm going to be there, and I'm looking forward to so much music this year, as always. What can we expect from what you're going to be presenting?
Oh, I'm doing Modesty of the Magic Thing with Willie.
Oh, incredible.
Oh, super excited about that. I just love playing that piece so much. We premiered it on the West Coast at Other Minds Festival. We premiered it on the East Coast at the Paula Cooper Gallery while they were doing, showing the work of DeFeo, her last 10 years of work, and paintings that had never been seen in New York before. And so they weren't the specific paintings or drawings that are referred to in the work, but there was an incredible synergy between everything that was in that room in the gallery. So there's that. And then we'll do it at Roulette just before Big Ears, Modesty of the Magic Thing, and then we'll take it to Big Ears. So I'm super excited.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually Oakland on Thursday to rehearse this new piece that I'm working on. That's sort of the sister piece, you could say.
Yeah.
But that I'm very, very excited to share this work with Big Ears.
Wonderful. Is that going to be the only performance you do there? Are you not part of Cobra this time, are you?
No. I'm just in and out.
Gotcha.
This time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, in addition to this sort of companion piece you allude to, what are the sort of the artistic questions you're starting to ask yourself about what's next, or what are you mulling?
I'm already in the midst of things. I'm doing a new acoustic harp project that is using a new system in Max that I'll be improvising with. So it's sort of acoustic electric project, which will also have a visual component, which I've never had before. And I want to also that I'll record by the end of this year. I'm making a new electric harp record, which is being inspired by some of the works of Daphne Oram, the electronic musician that worked at the BBC.
Wow.
And so there's a new electric harp project. And I'm writing a piece for my sisters who are in the Eclipse Quartet in California that will be a piece for Eclipse and acoustic harp in 4 channels. And this new sister piece to Modesty. So I have a lot on my plate. But that's what happens when you're not teaching.
Right. I mean, as I said earlier, when I was preparing, there's so much work to reckon with.
I know it's hard to pick what to focus on because we didn't talk about lace.
In fact, let's talk about lace for a moment. So
okay.
I'm actually still integrating my experience with listening to it. And I've been sort of in the last week or 10 days sort of in the Zeena musical universe.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. In fact, I wanted to tell you a story that, at the risk of, I hope it doesn't insult you or offend you in any way. Yesterday, I was listening to Lament for the Maker in my earbuds because I was doing some housework, and I was in the kitchen cooking. The sounds of my home were interacting with the sounds of the piece and the pieces.
Honored.
It was so crazy. And I was like, for a moment, I had this very light, but it was a somatic experience. And I was like, I don't know what's coming from where. It was really crazy. It was really crazy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. I totally love it. Not taken as an insult in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, I will say that the interesting thing about lace is it started again out of the necessity to have a score to use with a group of improvisers we were doing a piece I was invited to do something at the Merce Cunningham Dance Studio. And it wasn't going to be a piece for dancers. They were just presenting music in their studio. They had a series, Music Mondays. And I'd been invited to be a part of that. And my group was George Lewis, John King, and Fast Forward, the percussionist. And I was in a quandary as to what to do for these incredible improvisers because I'd done a lot of sewing in my past. I had scraps of fabric, and I happened to have these 5 pieces of lace, and I ended up, who knows why one gets an idea to something, but I slapped them on a board in as if they were 5 short movements, and made a set of conditions with which to read, as an improviser, with which to read these 5 pieces of lace. I had no idea if this was going to work. It happened to work, and it began a series of many movements of using this idea that continues to this day, actually. When I say it works, it means that it activated improvisers to work together with something that had a kind of DNA or identity that you could relate back to what the images were.
Thank you so much, Zeena Parkins, and thank you for tuning into the Tonearm. If you've enjoyed this conversation, check out the nearly 300 episodes available in our free archive at thetonearm.com. While you're there, join our mailing list or consider becoming a paid supporter. The Tonearm is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant, and our theme music is by Birdie, spelled B-U-R-D-Y. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.